Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. It is the week of November 13th, 2024, and today's episode is called Tell Me a Story. And the backdrop for today's episode is the presidential election that occurred a week ago, just over a week ago, here in the US, where I am right now. And what I do not want to do is parse the results or talk about what the implications are for Israel in a Trump administration or how a Harris version of the Israel policy would be different from Trump's. That's really not what I want to do. Instead, I want to take a completely different tack on this. And I want to look at what Israel can learn from Kamala Harris's defeat in the election. Many people were shocked at the outcome. I think there were many, many people who thought that Harris would win the popular vote. Maybe they even took it for granted that Harris would win the popular vote, but still might lose the Electoral College simply because of the quirks of how our electoral system works here in the US. Some thought she would win both the popular vote and the Electoral College. And I think there were a few, I mean, more than a few, although not in my circle, and that's part of it, is that when you're in your own bubble, you hear reinforcing messages. But there certainly were those who believed that Trump would win both the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. But I think what can't be debated is that the Democratic Party in the US has some thinking to do, needs to do a bit of back to the drawing board reconsideration of how they're going to run their campaigns, how they promote their candidates, what kind of candidates they choose. And there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking right now, what the Democrats could have done differently. And I think the conclusion that's often reached is that Democrats are simply out of touch with what people actually want. This conclusion being that Democrats didn't realize that what we call woke culture, with pronouns, with gender altering surgeries, what have you, just went a little bit too far. The American people weren't ready for it. That Harris never distinguished herself from Biden, never laid out a clear agenda of what a Harris administration would look like. They were out of touch with what people wanted in terms of that possible administration. And most of all, that Harris was out of touch on the biggest issue of all, the economy, that simply she didn't connect with voters on that issue. But I'm going to tell you what I think. I think that that interpretation is wrong. That the idea that Harris lost because Democrats are out of touch with what people actually want, that's mistaken. I actually don't think that's what it is. I actually think it's something much bigger. It's that the Democrats were and are out of touch with how people actually make decisions, how they think and decide about issues, not their feelings on the issues themselves. And this is where it ties into Israel and what we as advocates for Israel can learn. Because I think we're making some of the same mistakes that Democrats made. One of my favorite all-time Israelis is someone I've referenced on this podcast before, the late Daniel Kahneman. He was a soldier in the Israeli army who actually developed their very unique system for how to screen potential soldiers to decide what unit they should be in. He later went on to become a social psychologist, an economist, really an economist, but more of like a thought leader, you might say, at Hebrew University with his longtime professional partner, Amos Tversky. And Kahneman wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which if you haven't read, I so recommend. And won the Nobel Prize for his work in what we call social economics and rationality and human decision making. because he really turned the whole world of human decision making on its head. He really proved that human beings are not rational when it comes to making decisions. And I think both the Democrats and pro-Israel advocates like me have been obsessed with the rational. And here's what we can learn from both Kahneman's work and also from Harris's Lost. And this is relevant, I think, because when we talk about Israel, we wonder why people don't get it. We bang our heads against the wall saying it's so obvious. Why is the world not supporting Israel the way it should be? It's so clear that they are the good guys here. And I truly believe that they are. But again, we're making, I think, a lot of the same mistakes that the Harris campaign made. And what I want to do today is look at three takeaways from Harris's defeat and what we, as people who care about Israel and speak up about Israel, what we can learn from that so that we can do what we do better. Okay. So takeaway number one is that I think it's pretty clear that issues and facts are ultimately not what lead people to make a decision. You know, Harris was convinced that if she just talked enough about how Trump is a convicted felon, how Trump lowered taxes on billionaires and the ultra rich, that literally expectant mothers have died in hospitals while waiting for care due to restrictive abortion laws in the South. I mean, that's happened. And Harris thought if she just made, harped on those issues and pounded on them, made them clear, that people would come to her side. But it didn't work. And in the same way, a lot of us who are pro-Israel, we make the same mistake of thinking that the issues are what will convince people that Israel is in the right. And we don't understand why people don't get it. We try to make clear that Hamas uses civilians as human shields. We talk about how Hamas literally loots and steals humanitarian aid. We talk about the biggest fact of all, which is that on October 6th of 2023, there was a ceasefire. So all you people who are calling for a ceasefire now, you had it on October 6th, and Hamas broke it on October 7th. And we think that if we just remind people of these issues or find different ways to present these issues, that people will take the Israel side. And we've found over and over that that simply does not work. And I think we need to accept the fact that thinking and issues and logic will not and do not rule the day. Instead, it is about story. What Republicans were able to do, what Trump was able to do, was tap into the story that voters needed to hear. And that story is what ultimately connected voters, undecided voters, to him. To talk about another pretty famous Israeli, Yuval Noah Harari. He's the author of the book Sapiens. He's pretty well known at this point. But his whole theory is that what really distinguishes human beings from every other creature on Earth is story and our ability to listen to stories, comprehend stories, and to connect with stories. Yuval Noah Harari makes the point that probably the maximum number of gorillas or apes that you can get to do anything is maybe 40 or 50. That's like the maximum number of gorillas, apes, who could ever come together and work on a certain project unified. Even though they have, 95, 96, 97% of the shared DNA with us, the most that they can ever come together as a group and work together is in the mid 40s, 50s, 60s. However, human beings can unite by the millions. I mean, look how many people voted for Harris, for Trump. We did that in the hundreds of millions. And the reason, he says, is because we human beings have the ability to tell stories and to connect with stories. Once we believe in the story, then you can create militaries and countries and governments and have elections. Without those stories, there's a limit on how many creatures, souls, can actually work together. So we, as people who talk about Israel, have to, I'm not saying ignore the facts, but those need to take a back seat. Those facts need to be in service of something else, in service of the story. And look, I think we've all seen that the Palestinians in general, and even Hamas specifically, they are able to use story, whether it's the story of oppressed being pushed down by the oppressor, or the poor being pushed down by the colonists, whatever it is, there is a story that is working for them, and we are not telling stories. So that is takeaway number one. Takeaway number two is the role of celebrity. Harris had all these celebrities come out on her behalf, everyone from LeBron James and Oprah Winfrey to Beyonce, and even the biggest celebrity of all, Taylor Swift. And I think what we saw is that it didn't really matter. And I think we who advocate on behalf of Israel can learn something from this, because one thing I think we can agree on is that we have been really terrible. And I've talked about this before on this pod. We've been really terrible when it comes to choosing who to put forward to deliver our message. Our spokesmen never convey the message the right way. We have spokesmen for within our group, like Noah Tishby, who's become a spokesman and advocate for Israel, but she's very much in group. And I don't think she's moving the needle very much in terms of out of group. I see her more as a cheerleader, someone to rah us on as we feel alone, telling our Israel narratives and advocating. But in terms of actually moving the needle outside of our bubble, let's be honest, she's not doing that. And neither are any of the supposed influencers that we keep turning to. There's a very big Jewish conference coming up that I will not name. And for their keynote speakers, they are bringing in social media influencers. And this just boggles my mind. To me, this is so insulting that you would gather 100, multiple hundred of the people who care most about Israel, and you would present to them people who are most known for TikToks and tweets and posts on X and reels on Instagram. To me, that is just, it's childish. It's adolescent. It's talking down to the intelligence that we have as a people. And we need to wake up that popularity and celebrity is not going to change people's minds. I think maybe 30 years ago it would have, but we're in a different age now. It doesn't work that way. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and think carefully. Who do we want to be the advocates for Israel? Who do we want to be the public face and make a change? Number three, takeaway from Harris that we can learn from. The medium is the message. Or another way to say it, the messenger is the message. At the end of the day, I think Harris was not a very good candidate, and we could have known this. I mean, her approval ratings were quite low before Biden announced that he was dropping out of the race. Biden's approval ratings were quite low before he dropped out of the race. So to think that his vice president would be able to turn things around and have something fresh and new to say, that's on the Democrats for not realizing that that was completely ignorant and foolish. Harris was not a likable candidate, not the way she needed to be right now. And in the same way, Bibi is not a likable face for Israel. I mean, most Israelis don't like him. But just as bad is the fact of how Bibi comes across to world leaders, to the rest of the world. His arrogance, his steadfastness, his ignorance of cooperation with our greatest ally. Most Israelis would prefer he not be our leader. And one of the reasons is just because of how he portrays us to the rest of the world. So that's the third lesson we need to take away here. And I don't know that this was as relevant 50 years ago, but now that we live in this age of the image and social media and video and sound bites, who the face of your nation is as important as the message itself that that person is conveying. And I think that's why the one person who could really give Bibi a run for his money in the next election is Naftali Bennett, because Naftali Bennett really does convey the message the right way in his persona of the messenger itself. His English is pretty much perfect. He understands American and Western nuance. He knows a little bit more how to tell the story. He knows how to be honest, whereas the rest of the world does not see Bibi as an honest, humble, or even dedicated politician, someone dedicated to what's best for the country. So those to me are the three takeaways that Harris's defeat can actually hand us as a little gift for how to do our Israel presentation better. Focusing on story. And that's the reason, by the way, that this episode is called Tell Me a Story, because of the importance of story as opposed to facts and issues. The diminishing role of celebrity and the fact that the messenger is part of the message itself. It might be too late for these current wars, but Israel will always be on the hot seat, and it behooves us to think about these three takeaways and probably others as we think about our messaging in the future. We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with this week's news story and then your questions. And we are back on Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. There were a lot of news stories this week, but I want to pull out what I think is the biggest one in particular in terms of at least how Israelis are thinking about the news and what they're talking about. And that would be the firing of Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant and replacing him with Yisrael Katz as the new Minister of Defense. I won't go into the logistics of the hows and whys of the firing. You can read that in other places. The quick summary is that you need to know that Yoav Gallant is a member of Bibi's Likud party. So he's in the same political party as Netanyahu. He was fired once before in, I believe it was August of 2023, but then mass protests erupted and he was reinstated. So this firing is actually his second firing, the second firing of Yoav Gallant. And you need to understand that almost all Israelis see this as politically motivated. I don't know any Israeli that I've spoken to who said that they agree with this, that they think this is a wise move. You know, in poll after poll, Yoav Gallant was found to be one of the most trusted Israelis in the government, up there with Herzi Halevi, who is the IDF chief of staff. Far below them are Likud ministers, members of government, and of course Netanyahu himself. So Gallant was seen by many as running a very good war, even though his hands were tied. He was often blocked by Bibi from carrying out certain plans simply because Bibi had his own political aspirations in mind. And we had some major accomplishments under Yoav Gallant as a Minister of Defense, the taking out of Nasrallah and his successor, the taking out of the leaders of Hamas, both military and Sinwar and political, the taking out of high-level members of the Iranian National Guard, the Revolutionary Guard, and really dismantling the infrastructure in South Lebanon from Hezbollah's ability to carry out a potential October 7th style attack. So there's a lot of frustration. Here's what Israelis are thinking and talking about. There's a lot of frustration in Israel right now that Gallant was fired. It's to the point where a lot of reserve soldiers have said that they are not going to go back to Lebanon. They are not going to go back into Gaza. Their businesses are collapsing. Their marriages are suffering. Their children miss them and even have PTSD from having their fathers away so much. They're missing out on their university studies. And they're saying, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this when our leader, the prime minister, is basically using us for his own political gains, as clearly evidenced by firing a minister of defense who has years of experience and replacing him with Yisrael Katz, the new minister of defense, who has absolutely none, as in zero, military experience. That's right. The minister of defense in Israel has no military experience. So Israelis are extremely frustrated. And perhaps most frustrating of all is why Gallant was fired. Gallant advocated over and over for the drafting of ultra-Orthodox Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, into the IDF. You know, this has always been an issue in Israel for ideological reasons, that it's simply not fair that the ultra-Orthodox are not serving when the rest of the population is. But now it's not just ideology, it's a numbers game. We need 20,000 more soldiers. We are short 20,000 soldiers for the three wars that we are fighting: Lebanon, Gaza, and Iran. We need those soldiers. There's nowhere else to turn. We cannot keep turning to our reservists over and over when there is a whole population who is not serving. And Gallant very honestly and forthrightly said that we need to be drafting the ultra-Orthodox. But this was harming Bibi's ability to keep his coalition together. So Bibi fired him, which I, like so many of Israelis, just find completely unconscionable. But that's what Israelis are saying. They're very frustrated with this firing of Gallant, and frankly quite scared that we now have a minister of defense who doesn't have experience in defense and security. So that's our news story for the week. Now let's take a look at some questions that you sent in. Okay. Judy writes, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, there was a picture of protests against mandatory enlistments of the ultra-Orthodox. What is the story about what will happen to those who do not show up? And will their subsidies really be cut? So this goes to the point I was just talking about, that yes, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel are protesting their draft notices. They've been mailed draft notices. I believe 7,000 draft notices have already gone out to the ultra-Orthodox population. But almost all of them, like 98, 99%, have been completely ignored, as in torn up, thrown into the trash, ignored completely. And they don't show up at the induction center for the day they're supposed to be inducted. So Judy's asking, well, what's going to happen to those who are drafted but who do not show up? So far, nothing. They have not been put in jail, and their subsidies have continued. And again, this is why Israelis are so upset, because this population continues to act like a pariah. Sorry for the strong language, but there really is no other way to phrase it. They have been acting like pariahs, taking but not giving back. So right now, no, nothing is happening to those who don't show up at the induction center. What is happening is that the length of service of 18-year-old Israeli boys has been extended from 2 years, 8 months to 3 years, and reservists are serving. Some reservists are now at over 200 days served this year, in the past year alone. Miriam in New Jersey writes, it seems the world is very wishy-washy about standing up to Iran. It is obvious to any logical-minded person that the IRGC is 100% evil and wants to develop a nuclear bomb, not just for actions against Israel, the quote-unquote little devil, but also against the USA, the big devil, and really the entire non-radical Islamist world. However, the US and others have been letting Iran slide right into their nuclear capabilities. So my question, Judy asks, is could it be that most of the world prefers Iran actually has nuclear weapons so that they can be a counterpoint to Israel's nuclear arsenal, just like India and Pakistan, so that they can, quote unquote, cancel each other out and keep the region in check? Well, again, this is a really deep question, Miriam, not my expertise area, but I think I will attempt to answer it. I agree with you. To me, it's absurd. The entire world should know by now that Iran, Iranian actions, Iran's proxies, and the development of a nuclear missile, that's not just something against Israel. This is against the entire world. This is against all democracy. When they behead people in Iran for dressing incorrectly, women not having on the hijab, people, going against Sharia law, this is a signal. This is not a country of free speech, free press, freedom of expression. So, yeah, Iran's actions are against everyone. So I agree with you. I believe it's completely absurd that the world is not supporting Israel or either militarily or monetarily or at minimum rooting them on openly. But instead, what the world has been doing, including the US, is sort of this dance, this very, to use your phrase, wishy-washy approach. And I think they just are afraid. I think the world doesn't want to see escalation. But there's a great quote I heard recently that to prevent escalation, you need to escalate. To prevent things from blowing up, you need to blow a few things up and show strength. And right now, the U.S. is not showing its strength. And I believe that might play into as well why Harris lost, is because, the Houthis, this ragtag bunch from Yemen, are shutting down all international shipping. Are you kidding me? Where's the U.S. military might? Why are we not crushing them? But instead, the U.S. sits off to the side, releasing statements and sending ships to the region, but not really taking the action it should. Now, I do not think the reason is that they want Iran to be the counterpoint to Israel. Iran with a bomb is not trustworthy. No one in their right minds wants Iran to have a bomb. I think it's more just afraid of upsetting the status quo, tipping over the canoe, making waves, and not wanting to get involved. The U.S. and other countries don't want their militaries to get involved. But if they knew what were good for them, they would. Because this is not just Israel's problem. Last question, Sherry from Jacksonville. Joel, she writes, I'm really curious. If most salaries in Israel are low and the cost of living and taxes ridiculously high, which it is, and most Israelis can't afford to buy a home, where does this leave the average elderly Israeli? You can't work forever and continue paying rent. Is there subsidized housing? Any info or insights you can answer would be appreciated. So yes, on the one hand, Sherry, you are right. It is incredibly expensive to live in Israel in general, and specifically housing is out of control. There's a limited stock of housing. There's a great chapter on real estate and housing in the book I wrote with Benji, Israel 201. We talked to a professor at Tel Aviv University, and he gives many factors for why, but one of it is that government owns the land. So when it comes time to break ground on a new project, in the US, if you break ground, probably a year to 3 years later, you have an apartment building. In the US, in Israel, the average time between breaking ground and people actually moving into that building is 15 years. There's just so much red tape and bureaucracy because it's government land. That's one of the factors. So there really is a low housing stock. One thing I should make clear to you is that the people who are really suffering are younger Israelis. This phenomenon of not being able to buy a house, this is really a new phenomenon, I'd say in the past 15 to 20 years. Up until then, there was a normal path in life where you would go to high school, go to the army, get out of the army, travel a bit, go to university, meet someone, get married, and then the parents of the bride and groom would pool some money together and buy an apartment for the young couple. So in terms of the elderly, most of our elderly actually own their own places or are still able to pay the rent. They have not been affected by this shortage of housing. They have not been affected by the crazy real estate crisis that we're facing. We also have a pretty good system for taking care of our elderly. You do not see elderly out in the streets in Israel. Some of them live in Beit Avot, what you would call nursing homes, I guess. Many live in the apartments that they always lived in, again, because they were not affected by this housing crisis. Now, What's really going to be interesting is what's going to happen in 30, 40 years from now when the people who are 25, 30, 35, when they retire. I don't know if what will happen with them because many more Israelis, young Israelis certainly, are not buying homes because they are priced out and their parents, even the parents of both couples, can't pool together any money to actually uh, buy an apartment for the young couple because the prices are so out of hand. That wraps up this week's episode of Inside Israel. I appreciate all of you who wrote in with questions. As for next week's broadcast, I will let you know on Thursday when exactly that is going to happen. I have two events next weekend, one in New Jersey in the morning, one in Virginia in the evening. I don't know when the pod would fit in. It might be that we do it on Monday of next week. In any case, stay tuned to the Hebrews Magic newsletter, which will go out this Thursday. That will have the time, and I dare say will have the correct and final time for next week's pod. If you need that address, I'm going to put it in the chat right now. It's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Continue to write in your questions and send them to me. And I look forward to reading them and making that podcast based a lot on your questions to the extent that I can. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Joel Chasnoff. See you next week on Inside Israel. Lehitrot.